Good afternoon and welcome to the ChinaMed Tel Aviv University China in the Mid-Med Security and Connectivity in the North Africa webinar. This series looks at China's role in the wider Middle East and Mediterranean region from the inside out and is intended to complement our earlier series that looked at China's role in the Mid-Med from a global perspective. My name is Friedman, and I'm the Director of Research at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Professor Sela, the Chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University, Professor Enrico Fardella, the Director of the Center for Mediterranean Area Studies at Peking University, and the Director of the ChinaMed Project, and Dr. Andrea Ghiselli, the Director of Research for the ChinaMed Project and a researcher at Fudan University. It's now my honor and privilege to introduce our guests, our panelists for today's session. I'll start with Dr. Lina Benabdallah, Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University in the United States. Her book, Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2020. We're also joined today by Eric Olander, who is the co-founder of the China-African Project, an independent, nonpartisan media initiative dedicated to China's engagement in Africa. Eric has almost over 25 years of experience in journalism. He's a fluent Mandarin speaker, and he has a BA in East African History from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA in Chinese Public Affairs from the University of Hong Kong. Thank you both, Lina and Eric, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to a lively session. And maybe we can get started with a question about, since we're focused on the inside-out perspective, on how elites throughout North Africa perceive China today, and perhaps whether those perceptions have changed in recent years. And maybe Lina, we'll start with you and then move to Eric, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this. And so, yeah, elites' perceptions from North Africa about China have been, I think, from a historical perspective until today, from what I can see, have been rather positive. If we take a look at some specific cases, for instance, Egypt and Algeria, we could see that China's relations with these two countries have been, or the CCP have started long before even independence in the case of Algeria. And the elite relations between these two countries and Chinese elites have been extremely positive, and we saw that through the test of COVID-19, and we saw the engagement between China and several governments throughout North Africa be extremely positive. And the discourses of several of these elites when talking about their cooperation with China, whether it's through COVID, like I mentioned, or before, have been extremely positive. And so China is perceived to be or the Chinese government is perceived to be a strong and long time ally of these governments during their anti-colonial fights, during their post-independence development, and most certainly more recently during since in the 2000s onwards.
Thank you. Eric, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Lina's been saying. I think it's been really characterized by stability, but we've seen a change in, I'd say, in the past 1 to 2 years, particularly in a country like Egypt, which traditionally Egypt was getting a lot of support from the United States, and under the Mubarak regime, it was much more aligned with the United States. But really over the past couple of years, the Al-Sisi government has really embraced China in ways that are somewhat surprising in so many ways. So for example, earlier this year in January, when Wang Yi made his first foreign trip overseas, he went to Cairo and he brought right to the heart of the Arab street the message about Xinjiang. And that was a very bold move, and he was very warmly embraced. And then we got a little sense again of what both Arab states, Gulf states, and even some Mideastern states in the Mediterranean states felt at the recent China-Arab States Cooperation Forum that happened this week. And again, when we can hear directly from elites, foreign ministers, and others going on the record with really strong endorsement of a lot of Chinese political values, non-interference, the respect for sovereignty. And a lot of these are really code words that are signaling an alignment with a Chinese worldview that we wouldn't have probably seen 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that's just something to note as well. We can talk about that in more detail later.
Thank you, Eric. If I could follow up, and I asked the opening question about elites, maybe I know it's oftentimes very difficult to gauge how popular processions, what are oftentimes referred to in the Middle East as the street, but so I don't want to be overwhelmingly essentialist, I suppose, in trying to characterize how large swaths of North Africa perceive China at the popular level. But to the extent that we can gauge it, even anecdotally, do we see kind of the same elite positive impressions amongst what I would say the popular level, or are different kinds of impressions, or is there generally apathy or indifference?
Lina?
And if I can take, I think it probably is going to be a mix of all of these things, but I think overall, from my perception of what the sort of non-elite level, there are not a lot of people, for instance, average people or students, or if I think even of my relatives or friends have been to China or know much about China. What their perceptions are about China typically are sort of secondhand, what you get from TV, what you get from media in general. There isn't a whole lot of sort of grassroots level exchanges or interest in really knowing either the Chinese language or culture, or really knowing, or traveling to China. So China is far away. It's a concept. But at the same time, I follow, for instance, China's embassy in Algeria's Facebook page, and I see comments. I'm always interested in, what audience says, and the comments about whatever the post is, and the comments tend to be extremely positive and extremely sort of repeating sort of the trope of sort of solidarity between China and the Algerian people, and going back to history, and sort of really being positive in that sense. And those tend to be the few people who probably are students or people who have had some interaction with China at some point or other, and those tend to be extremely positive. But at the same time, we know from things like Afrobarometer surveys that to a lot of sort of your average people, and I think there were a couple of North African countries in the Afrobarometer, the perceptions typically associated with China would go to those stereotypes about sort of quality of goods, and those tend to be sometimes bring in sort of negative perception about what Chinese goods are doing in the market, and the perceptions about Chinese labor. Those tend to be sort of the sources of negative perceptions, if there's such a thing. When Masoud Ozil had posted on Instagram about the Uyghur question and Xinjiang, that has sparked, for instance, I remember that summer, it was last year in August or I think it was July or August, it sparked a huge sort of echo in just sort of the street, as you said. And that's because Masoud Ozil is so popular. That was the first time that a lot of people have heard about the Uyghur question. It wasn't from the government, it wasn't from state media in Algeria, but it was from Instagram. And that had started conversations about this, and it had actually also really diversified, in a sense, sort of the opinions and the perceptions about Chinese government and about Muslim minorities in China.
Thank you, Lina. Eric, did you want to add? Yeah, this is something that I follow very closely, in part because what I do every day is I put together, some of you get my newsletter, and what I'm doing is combing through kind of all the media. And what surprises me is there's a huge disparity in the discourse about China going on in sub-Saharan Africa as there is in North Africa. And in fact, there's almost no conversation going on in North Africa compared to what's going on in Southern Africa. A couple different reasons that might be accounting for it. Number one, there isn't the debt relationship, for example. We're looking, I mean, let's see, right now, Algeria has $9 million of loans with China. Morocco has $1.2 billion. I mean, this is really there's not the debt relationship that, say, Nigeria is starting to fill up, Kenya has, Djibouti, that we have in sub-Saharan Africa. So that removes a big part of the tension. As a result of not having the debt, you also don't have the presence of Chinese workers, big infrastructure projects, and that very physical presence that the Chinese have in sub-Saharan Africa, which does cause some tension, as you would see in any type of cross-cultural interaction. The other factor that I see is that in a country like Egypt, where the media is much more tightly controlled by the government, whereas in a country like Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa, you have a very vibrant independent media that is oftentimes very vocal in their expressions against the Chinese. That media then feeds into social media streams. When we think about social media, one of the things is not to think about it on a national level. I look at social media more as like the jet stream of like weather patterns. And so you'll see memes, for example, that will pick up through French, social media and go from Paris all the way down to West Africa and then down to Gabon and then into Djibouti. And they kind of flow this way. Same with the English. They're transnational in that way. And a lot of the social media memes about the Chinese are oftentimes in Arabic coming in from the Gulf or the Mideast. And oftentimes the French ones are coming down from France. And so the narratives oftentimes are not necessarily being driven by North Africa and the perceptions there. One of the things that I find looking at French, I don't speak Arabic, but I do follow French media very closely, and French social media in Africa and in Algeria and whatnot, is so much of the media narrative about the Chinese emanates from Paris. And that's I think that's one of the big opportunities in the space, is to start creating analysis and insight in French and in Arabic from an African perspective. And that is really what's missing in the discourse right now. And I think in part because, again, so much of the media is tightly controlled. I also think there's a heavy amount of indifference and apathy because it's just not relevant in there. And again, as Lina pointed out, it's a very exotic, very far away. And just, again, I was surprised this week when covering the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. Al Jazeera didn't even cover that. We had a meeting of every Arab GCC and Mediterranean foreign minister, and Al Jazeera didn't even cover it with Wang Yi. And I think that serves the Chinese very, very well to have that low profile. But it's just remarkable to me that the National in United Arab Emirates didn't cover it, Al Jazeera didn't cover it. Only a few state-run media organizations out of Tunisia and Egypt covered it. And that, again, I think is just, there's not a sense that the Chinese are a big player yet.
Thanks. That's a great answer, Eric. And Lina, your points were really interesting regarding Ozil. It takes a soccer star to sort of wake up the street, or a football star. And I think that one of the powerful, I suppose, tools that we now see is perhaps this social media space, and Eric, you alluded to it as well. And I would wonder whether the Chinese activity in the social media space is something we're beginning to see as well. But I want to turn the questions over to one of my colleagues. Andrea had a question, and give him a chance. Enrico, you can follow Andrea, please.
Okay, thank you both for the great answers. Very interesting, very, very interesting. So my question is I would say mostly about Egypt, actually. It was very interesting to hear about the fact that like local elites are starting to use those kind of keywords that are typical of the Chinese discourse from time to time. And there is this very, as I understand, kind of positive attitude at the elite level toward China. So the question is, on the one hand, I see Chinese media, they often treat Egypt as a sort of declining regional power. They really don't see Egypt as the country that used to be. So they say, especially after the Arab Spring, Egypt is not the leader of the region anymore. they are the shadow of what they used to be. So it seems to me that there's not, like, Egypt is not that attractive partner anymore. So how would you explain this discourse from the Chinese side vis-a-vis the use of keywords from the Egyptian side? I think this is, and this is not the only case. Like, I didn't know about Egypt, but the same thing happens in Syria. So it's not like is not unique. So I was wondering what you think about this sort of disparity, this sort of difference in how the two sides talk about each other.
Lina.
I was going to say maybe this. The way I was thinking about this is it could have something to do with something that Eric has written about and talked about. So if you want to elaborate on it, by all means. But could this have something to do with garnishing sort of international support and the gains for Beijing, for instance, when there is a discourse coming out of Egypt or Syria or Algeria that resonates or that echoes buzzwords put out by China, or the buzzwords that sort of are aligned with a Chinese worldview. These are reinforcing in a way of a Chinese vision of how to conduct sort of its presence in Africa and abroad and internationally. And what I was thinking there is, you know, when we mentioned the case of Egypt, there was also an op-ed, or Xinhua just posted last week, a series of articles about how different African leaders are supportive of China's Hong Kong new Hong Kong law, for instance. And when you look at the content of those articles, much of that is about sort of what Eric was talking about earlier, sort of resonating, echoing, repeating the same language. So sharing the basic language to talk about international events and Hong Kong and other issues is really important for Chinese political cause, because you have an alignment, and it starts with language. It starts how you talk about things, and then how you think about them, and how you project the way that you think about these things. And so, in a sense, I think that language is really important. The connection there is very important to speak about international events and have part of your portfolio of words and language and discourse the same alignment or the same language used by Chinese foreign policy makers. I think is really, it's a huge win, and it's a huge gain for Beijing.
Yeah, I would say that Egypt, of all the countries in North Africa, and I have a different reading than you, and certainly maybe even than Xinhua, dare I say that. But what I've been seeing is that the Chinese have been investing more into Egypt in terms of political capital than anywhere else in North Africa. So Algeria, Tunisia, Libya is a separate case. We can talk about Libya a little bit later. But because of its geostrategic location, Chinese warships are passing through the Suez. The Chinese have made big investments in the Suez Free Trade Zone and the Suez, those areas down there. There's about $4.5 billion of loans that are going, significantly more than in other parts of North Africa. The proximity to the base in Djibouti, I think, is important. And there's also, again, an alignment, a spiritual alignment between al-Sisi and the Chinese. Remember how al-Sisi came to power. He came to power by putting the Muslim Brotherhood into submission. And I think there's a common talking point here about putting Muslim separatists and Muslim extremists into submission, and particularly right now when the Chinese are doing something to that very effect in Xinjiang. And that's one of the reasons why I think someone like Wang Yi feels comfortable going to Cairo. And again, I thought it was very, very surprising and bold on the part of Wang Yi to do that, because showing up in Cairo talking about the internment of hundreds of thousands of Muslims, that's a daring thing. I mean, again, you got to give them credit for, they laid it out. And of course, this was all planned in advance, but, Foreign Minister Al-Shukri, he kind of said, yep, we're right there with you. And again, we've seen this time and time again with the Egyptians as supporting the Chinese on issues like Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on a number of these kind of separatist sovereignty, non-interference, all these code words that the Chinese love to use. And I think there is some kind of spiritual alignment on that front. I also think The United States has valued its relationship with Egypt for decades during the Cold War. Obviously, the United States now is not as active as it used to be. It doesn't have the influence, and Egypt is looking for new great power patrons. And I think in some ways, Al-Sisi has been very effective at playing the United States and China off each other much more delicately than other countries have. But I think the US-China, US-Egyptian relationship does come into factor there, given the importance historically that Washington has assigned to Cairo.
I might just add in, if I could, that Egypt is still also a cultural power in the Arab world, and I think the point you're making, Eric, sort of suggests that as well. Enrico, you wanted to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Brandon. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Eric and Lina. Very interesting indeed. Actually, I had a question before on perception, but let me first add two fingers, like a short question on Xinjiang, because I would like to know whether you can find an explanation on the reason that brought Egypt and Algeria to sign the letter in support of China's policy in Xinjiang, while Morocco and Tunisia didn't sign. Can you describe, like, is there like some political institutional reasons for that?
Lina?
I'm not quite sure that there is. I don't know exactly. I noticed as well, but I don't know exactly if there is an explanation about that. So when I looked at, for instance, the countries that were supportive of the Hong Kong, for instance, the same thing, but the case of Hong Kong, for instance, Morocco signed, Algeria didn't. And then we look at Xinjiang the other way around. So Algeria signed. So I'm not sure if it's just a matter of who was present at the day when the delegates just were sending their signatures. I'm not sure if it's what exactly, but I know, for instance, I know that in the case of Algeria, the Algerian ambassador in China had said that they were invited, that a delegation from the Algerian embassy was invited to go visit, one of those tours that the Chinese government provides to diplomats to go visit Xinjiang. And when he came back, he actually wrote favorably of his experience visiting, which is to say that in a way, you can connect that to saying, once, after that visit, he came back and basically he gave his green light. And so the Algerian representative at the UN office had felt, that Algeria would be signatory. And basically the grounds are, again, sort of that sovereignty, something, and a principle and a norm that's kind of respected and, endeared in the China-Algeria relationship. It's something that has been part of the China-Algeria relationship since the 50s. And so this whole idea about borders and sovereignty and territory and sort of anti-imperialism and framing it all in that sense just really made sense to the Algerian elite. Why Morocco wasn't signatory, I don't know. But I also don't know why Algeria wasn't signatory of the latest Hong Kong thing when it was for Xinjiang. So, but maybe Eric has something more to add, yeah.
No, I think any type of assigning any type of reason to this, as Lina pointed out, is speculative. And I think one of the things that I've learned in talking to African stakeholders on these kinds of issues is oftentimes there isn't a reason. As Lina indicated, maybe the Chinese delegation actually just didn't get around to lobbying that particular delegation. For the most part, I have this rule that I've been writing regularly in my newsletter, and it's the JZ rule of 4T-HKXJ. 4T-HKXJ, for those of you who don't know, is Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the party, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, okay? So those are the red lines for China. And the JZ rule of foreign policy is I've got 99 problems and 4T-HKXJ isn't one of them. So when the Chinese come walking around and saying, we want you to support us on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, a country like Algeria, Tunisia goes, you know what? Sure, fine, whatever. It's, because they see what's happening in Australia. They see what's happening in Canada. They see what's happening with the Swedes, where the Chinese bring in all of government, a hammer down on countries that cross those red lines. And these countries do not want, they don't want to get mixed up into that. So oftentimes, Western, US, European outside observers will try to assign a value to whether one country supports China or doesn't support China. And I think that's a mistake in looking at it. generally speaking, they don't really want to have anything to do with these red line issues. They just want to keep their head down because they see very clearly what the NBA went through and what anybody who crosses the Chinese on these red lines, and it's just not worth it to them. What I find interesting about Xinjiang in particular is that because there is no video, and again, this is not an emotive issue for Muslims in North Africa and other parts of the world. And something that my partner, Cobus van Staden at the South African Institute of International Affairs points out is that the difference in Muslim, even African Muslim reaction to the Arab-Israeli and the Arab-Palestinian issue versus what's happening in China. And his theory, and we're still working on these theories, and we've been looking at this as well in terms of Black Lives Matter in the US and what happened in Guangzhou. The intensity of the emotion about what happened in Guangzhou in the response was just white hot. And there's a very different type of emotion that Africans are having to Black Lives Matter in the United States. Again, just very, very different, trying to kind of understand the subtleties of this. But imagery, history, iconography, social media all play into this. And that too creates less pressure on policymakers to respond to the Chinese because they're not getting bottom-up social media pressure on Xinjiang the way they would say in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Again, these are all new concepts that we're trying to kind of piece together, muddle through, but it's just something that we've been thinking about a little bit.
Great, Eric.
Yeah,
Enrico had a follow-up question you wanted to ask. Enrico, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and actually there are lots of bells ringing because I think that there are a lot of assonances with some of the experience I've got in by analyzing like other countries in the region. By the region, I mean like the Mediterranean region. I have a question on this because this kind of this explanation on like trying not to find a sort of like conceptual structure that justifies this different positioning. I think is very important because it's very real. Do you think that this kind of management is related to a cultural element that somehow doesn't pay the same kind of attention and importance to the normative aspects of like political handling of Chinese issues, namely, the fact that, for example, in the South China Sea, having like a supporting China vis-a-vis Philippines, might represent a sort of might have an impact on global governance, on the normative aspect of global governance. So do you think that this is due to the cultural element in the North African diplomacy that doesn't attribute the same kind of importance than European and Americans do attribute to the solidity and the respect of these norms, or is related to another aspect which is more human? And this is something that I also notice in Southern European countries at times, namely the fact that there is not enough training on China. And so people, they tend somehow to take positions without knowing exactly the implications of these positions.
Go ahead, Lina.
Eric, maybe you want to start?
I think, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say maybe I would say probably a mix of both. I mean, I'm not sure so much about sort of maybe assigning too much sort of an essentialist way of thinking about these norms, but most certainly I could see how a lot of people don't know what the ramifications are on, saying something supportive of China regarding Hong Kong or regarding Xinjiang. I mean, it is very possible that, just like Eric was saying earlier, that your gains from it are much higher than what you would lose if you get smeared by, someone saying, hey, how come you're okay with a policy that's discriminatory or a government that's discriminatory against its Muslim population. And whether this is, I mean, to the cultural aspect that you were talking about, I mean, I think it's also true that there isn't a whole lot of understanding. In Algeria, for instance, with the question of Xinjiang and Hong Kong, it's not talked about in the media. The media is very much controlled by the government, and it's just not it's just not in the agenda. It's just not something mentioned. And so what, people know about this, they know it from social media, they know it from here and there. And because the media is the narrative is controlled by state media, then, then it's have any huge repercussions for signing, the letter or being part of the signatories, because at the end of the day, nobody is going to really talk about it in the media. So it's just censored in that sense.
Well, and you have to assume that the United States in various forums are going up to these same countries and trying to get them to not sign up for Huawei, to not sign these letters, and again, I don't have any insight into this politics or this diplomacy, but when I looked at who all the signatories are, and not a single developing country, not one, signed up with the US, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand on the latest Hong Kong kind of issue. That is a statement. I don't know if it's intentional or if it's just inadvertent. I don't know what it is, but time and time again, China's done an extraordinarily effective job at rallying these developing countries. Now, a statistic came out today that 80% of the signatories on the Hong Kong letter were Belt and Road countries. And again, is it hostage politics where the Chinese put a gun to the head and say, if you sign this, there's going to be no more investment? Probably not. They don't have to say that. You don't have to spell it out for people. Is it that these countries don't necessarily see China as a global power the way that they look at the United States, or the way that they see France's role in a country like Algeria, which is still very, very deeply enmeshed? So the stakes are very, very low for them to do something like this. I also think that there is a little bit of, putting the middle finger up to the Americans. These are statements, and I think there's an opportunity to push back against Washington, particularly under this administration, which they're not too happy about, because again, it shows a failure of American foreign policy in its inability to recruit or to lobby or to align any of these countries. We're talking South American countries, South Asian countries, African countries, Gulf countries, you name it. None of them. It was a lily white group that was on that on the list supporting the Hong Kong letter. Or opposing the Hong Kong letter. And so I think these are all factors in it. But at the end of the day, to echo what Lina was saying, knowledge of China still remains abysmally low in these countries. I was with some North African diplomats last year in Beijing, and one of them joked to me, said, everybody in our government who knows anything about China is in this bar right now. That's it. There's nobody else. And back home, nobody in the foreign ministry knows anything about China. There's like 6 of us who know everything. And he says, if we get sick tomorrow and disappear, it is over. And that's a big, big problem. And so I find that they're very, very deferential to the Chinese, in part because, well, it's considered low stakes. It's very exotic. They don't consider the Chinese necessarily to be a global power. That may be changing, but for now, they don't put them on par, I think, in my opinion, as the same as the traditional legacy powers. So it's more transactional, and it's more about economics and investment in my kind of humble view.
I mean, and also to add something to this, it's interesting to see who signed these letters, but it's also really interesting to see who didn't. And so silence in these matters is just as important as voices and votes. And when you look at, for instance, the the list of countries that had the letter opposing China on Xinjiang, yeah, I mean, basically the big kind of names are there. US, you get France, you get Australia, but also there were lots of countries missing. So Greece, for instance, and Italy, for instance, neither one of them have joined either side. And it's really interesting to ask that question as well. So why? I mean, are we going to assign some sort of, is it BRI, for instance? Is it, just this random thing that you just didn't want to get entangled with? Is it some domestic politics thing that made it a thing? So it's really interesting to see those absences as well as presence.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe thank you, Lina. Ori wanted to ask a question. Ori, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe it's a rise of a new type of non-alignment, but
that's what the Chinese would like you to think. By the way, they love that concept. They when I post these things on Twitter, I get all the Chinese kind of, I don't know what they are, but they're the paid kind of trolls out there who are like, echoing things, and they're like Ben Young, Ben Young, Ben Young, Ben Young all the time. So I think they like that idea.
As long as you don't ally with the wrong side, it's non-alignment.
That's right.
But my question goes back to what you were saying earlier about the sense of kind of shared history in terms of going against colonialism and things like that, and historical terms, and on the other hand, also the issue that many of the countries that we're talking about have very little debt to China. And here I'd like to bring to the floor the issue that China is being accused of often in recent years, which is neocolonialism in Africa, but perhaps not in these specific regions. So how do let's call them the actors in the countries that you're working on in the north of Africa, how do they perceive this whole notion of neocolonialism, if they even discuss it at all?
Eric, you want to take this first?
Yeah, I mean, when they think about neocolonialism in Algeria, and Lina, you've been following this as closely as I have, they're thinking about the discussion that's going on right now with France and Macron and what he's been saying about coming to terms with colonialism. I don't think the Chinese come into the discussion at all about colonialism in North Africa. And that is just, and I don't think Egypt is concerned about that. Egypt is a country that has the cultural confidence to not be worried about being conquered colonially by the Chinese. I think Tunisia, Algeria are still, you know, their minds are still wrapped up in France in that sense. So the discourse that's going on in sub-Saharan Africa and points south is radically different than what's going on in the north. We can talk about the debt and other issues, but I just don't think it, from what I've seen in the French and the English discussions, any Chinese colonial references are coming into it. But I have very strong views on this, but Lina, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to echo exactly what Eric was saying. I don't think that I've seen much use to the analytical framework of China-North Africa relations be around neo-colonialism. I've seen, you know, maybe when we're talking about trade imbalances, you know, trade volume imbalances, it makes sense to think about sort of dependency or think about imbalance in trade and think about power disparities. I mean, there is no question that there are huge power disparities between China and, you know, North African partners, just like it would apply to China and the rest of Africa. But at the same time, I think because of history, and especially if you take the case of Algeria, like Eric was saying, colonialism has a very different. It's still a lived history in a way. I mean, it's a present history. It's
right.
Not something that's so far away that it can be reduced to some, you know, shorthand for big power investments coming in and, you know, taking most of the contracts, or it doesn't have an economic, you know, imperial relation. It doesn't have a financial debt trap connotation. It's still, colonialism is very much what, you know, classically we think of colonialism is. And it is, you know, for Algerians still something that you see in the news and in history and people's lives every day. So to kind of think about China-Algeria relations and colonialism is actually pretty offensive to a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's not relevant.
Yeah, but you know, but certainly you could think of power disparities and economic, financial.
So when North African countries discuss what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, do they use these terms or do they think about these terms? Not at all. This is an irrelevant issue whatsoever.
From the point of view of North African countries, and by the way, generally countries don't talk about these things. This is from civil society up.
Of course.
And I think when we talk about the perceptions of Chinese throughout Africa, there's a massive chasm between governing elites and between civil society. And these issues that you're talking about, these words like debt trap and colonialism, that's all coming up from the civil society part, media, NGOs, even legislators, opposition parties and whatnot. But from the governing elites, there's very little daylight between them and the Chinese. And we see this over and over again.
So in civil society, you do see that, or not at
No,
all?
not in North Africa. I don't see it.
Okay.
No, not because, again, I see the discourse in North Africa, just at least on the French language side, being dominated by what's going on in France. And just remember why, because you go to a city like Paris and it's, you know, people have family and relations and friends, and, you know, there's just so much connection with France over, decades and decades and centuries. They don't have that connection. There's not a lot of Algerians who are studying in China. And so when all of the events happened in Guangzhou and when COVID kind of broke out in China, there wasn't the same reaction as there was in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are tens of thousands of sub-Saharan Black Africans who were there. So again, that fed social media and the anger and whatnot. That just isn't there. Algeria was very quick to evacuate its nationals, and it was one plane load, I think. It was really not much at all. I mean, it was very short. And I think that plays into it as well. So when you see police maltreatment of Algerians in Paris, that resonates on Facebook and on WhatsApp and on Twitter in a way that, because it's just so constant, and there's an emotive historical kind of context for that.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up a bit about the general perceptions. I mean, when you look at a lot of news media, I mean, just the titles, the catchiest titles about China, Africa are titles that would use the word scramble, like sort of the scramble for Africa, the new scramble for Africa. And more recently, these sort of new echoes of a new Cold War, sort of China, US, and where Africa fits into this. This is what kind of comes back to a lot of people's minds about sort of, is this colonialism? So that's the sort of the extent to which you see these conversations. And unfortunately, more and more now, when we see the tense relations between the US and China, that translates into a lot of people trying to understand this as, oh, is this a new colonialism? Is this, the new imperial power over Africa? And so to that extent, I think you see those images coming back in media, but whether this is an actual framework that people from North Africa have used to think about China's broad engagement in the continent broadly, yeah, I don't think that I have actually seen much of that.
Enrico, you had another question. Please go ahead.
Yeah. It's related to what this discussion that I find extremely stimulating. There was this criticism of like the level of neocolonialism when it comes to Chinese activities in Africa has been already quite, articulated by the academia. Deborah Brodigan, I think, did a very good job, as much as Eric. I'm a loyal follower of Eric, and for example, all the discussion about Nigeria and the debt, I think it's very telling, instructive in this regard. Now, if you look at North Africa, can you tell us, like in very simple terms, how would you explain Chinese activities and presence in this area as not being neo-colonial? And maybe if you can provide like one or two example, or for example, an investment or.
Yeah, I see China as being much more again, what China-Africa to me is a 21st century phenomena, not an 18th century phenomena. And so I equate more to Goldman Sachs than I do to the East India, tea company in that sense, because the Chinese are much more pragmatic. It's not ideological. So when we look at, for example, the relationship with Algeria, Algeria is the sleeper of the China-Africa story. It doesn't get anywhere near the attention, but when you look at the quantity of investment, particularly in manufacturing that's going there, the auto sector is strong. They look at North Africa as a gateway into Europe for manufacturing. Obviously, they're building on the supply chains that the French have built there. So Peugeot, Renault, and all these other brands, Citroën, have manufacturing operations in these countries. There's pipelines and there's transmission in distribution into the European Union. Again, oil is also a big player in with Algeria. So that's where those relationships are, and that's one of the reasons why I think they're fundamentally stable, because they're aligned in that sense. There isn't, again, the presence of tens of thousands of workers. There isn't the presence of massive amounts of debt. So if there is any example of the kind of, the idyllic, win-win that the Chinese love to go on about, in some ways, North Africa, or at least Algeria, really represents it, because both are getting what they want out of it without any of the downsides. And again, I see over and over again press releases for new investment going into places like Algeria that don't get really much attention. Today, the news was a $25 million deal in Egypt for Dongfang and Al Nasser to build electric vehicles. This is the kind of great headlines that the Chinese love.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from my perspective, academically speaking, what's interesting to me about how we conceptualize China-Africa relationship outside of a colonial framework or neo-colonial framework, I mean, to me, it's how China-Africa relationship is a place for shaping Chinese-centered norms and values and views and models about models of development, or models of media governance, or models of internet governance, or models of journalism, these norms are so much more easily experimented with and readily received in countries in Africa than they are, for instance, in China's immediate neighboring countries, or much farther away in Europe or the US. And I think that that's a really interesting part of the China-Africa relationship in general. I mean, aside from everything else that's going on, aside from the ports, aside from the natural resources, aside from the infrastructure projects, there's a whole other side to this, which is precisely to take a run at what it would look like sort of for the Chinese development model to be taken by the Algerian government, or by some, and to the point of examples, we see this more and more happening with, authoritarian governments in a lot of African countries, thinking about what you would do, with your opposition parties. What would you do with your protests? How would you? Certainly, there is an easy connection to be made there in terms of where you want to learn, internet governance, or how do you want to apply censorship in social media, for instance, to squash protests. That's something that's right there, easily available, that you can have a relationship with a big power that's going to provide you with the know-how, the knowledge, and also, square you away with software deals if you wanted them. And I think that this is really important. I think it's for me, it's not complete to look at China-Africa relationship just from sort of these material resources, but it's really important to see what's in it for the values, for norms, for these different models.
Sounds like you're really depicting 19th century India, but let's put that aside for a second. So you're talking about those different norms. I'm curious about, for example, talking about those such norms. For example, do you see the social credit system as something that would be of interest to North African countries, or in opposition to sub-Saharan countries?
I'm not sure I see any indications or signs that social credit system, that requires a big state capacity. I don't think any of these countries have it. And that's sort of maybe a wishful thinking. I don't know. I haven't seen any of that either. but pragmatically speaking, on the ground, that's not a project that's going to. But also, you have to have connectivity. You have to have power. You have to have everybody supplied with, the basic needs for them to get on any, digital infrastructure. We don't have that. Number of people who access internet, for instance, in Algeria is dismal compared to just its neighbors in the Maghreb. And then when you go even bigger about like power and about connectivity, that's just the no indication that that's pragmatically feasible, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so there's a whole architecture that's required to do that that's missing in most of it, and pretty much anywhere. China is very unique in many respects in what they've been able to do, both for historical and political reasons, and cultural reasons as well. The way I see it in Africa is that countries look at China and their political model as a buffet. And they're not going to, and again, we as Americans oftentimes look at everything in a binary. You're with us or you're against us. Are you going to follow the Chinese or the Russians, or you're going to follow us? And when we try to impose our value norms on others, we expect that people will take the whole thing and become like us. Whereas you look at a country like South Africa, where they love the fusion of the ANC and the state government. And so they look to the CCP model as really something that they want to emulate. You look at a country like even Nigeria and Zimbabwe right now, which are looking at the Chinese model for internet governance. They're not going to take the whole, kit and caboodle of the way that the CCP runs China, but they are going to take bits and pieces of it. The Chinese are very interesting on this front. They're not trying to necessarily sell them the whole package. So as Lina pointed out, if Huawei, if country X wants to buy a Huawei system and they want to learn how to do monitoring and they want to learn how to do, that type of surveillance, they'll do it. No problem. They'll put the financing in there with it. If they don't, that's okay too. And so they'll give you all the range. And so in many ways, it's like a menu and you pick what you want to customize your political system. What they are showing though, and I think this is really, really important, is there is an alternative to the Western liberal model. And there's an alternative that, and this is the best part of Chinese soft power. And the Chinese are so stupid for investing in all the CGTN and Xinhua and all that stuff because nobody pays attention to that. What you hear over and over again is when Africans and North Africans and anybody from the developing world goes to a city like Shanghai or Beijing and they say, holy moly, 40 years ago, this country was poorer than my country, and now look at this place. And that is an incredible power. And countries want to emulate that. And they did it without democracy, and they did it without bringing on Western political systems. And that, too, is very appealing to one-party states and to authoritarian governments, that it can be done. And I think so what they do is they say, okay, you can have bits and pieces. We'll show you how to build railroads. We'll show you how to build infrastructure. We'll show you the policy framework for human rights. So this idea of, and the Chinese have perfected this more than anybody else, which is the focus on social and economic rights ahead of civil and political rights. And they'll give you all the rhetoric, and it's a kind of like a kit. And you go out and you kind of talk to the Americans using this kit. And I think in some ways that's what we've seen, and countries look to China for that, rather than a whole system.
Eric, if I might ask you like a question a quick question on what you just said. Lina, I would like to also to hear your opinion on this. Do you think this is this kind of admiration for Shanghai type of cities or what they symbolize? Do you think it's something that belongs to actually is an institutional perception, or this belongs to the Africa dream? So my question is, because China can be instrumental to reinforce the power of a certain group of people that is looking at China's model, to reinforce the stability of the regime or their own power, okay, and guarantee a certain degree of development that creates a constituency within that is a pillar of this power. But how about, is this like a general perception also for the new generation? So are the new generation living is there a China dream component? Supposedly there is a China dream. By the way, is there a China dream component in the African dream? I know that my friend Ori, Professor Sela, is laughing at it, but
no, I'm a fan.
Yeah.
No,
sure.
listen, I think there is something there. And, 82,000 Africans study in China today. And China comes to Africa to recruit students. And Jack Ma now is really one of the new faces of Chinese soft power in Africa because he's talking about technology, entrepreneurialism, youth. He's, and so I do think there is part of this China dream. I hate to use that because that's a very loaded word. That's like make America great again, whatever that is. So the idea here is that, but this idea that a developing country that, 30, 40 years ago was as poor as them is something that is now the second largest economy in the world and is rivaling the United States is something that is aspirational for a lot of people to be able to say, we want to do the same thing. Now, there's concern that they are falling back into some of the same paradigms that they had in the colonial era, particularly in countries like Kenya, where the debt is massive, and that is complicating some of that. But when you talk to, we just interviewed for our podcast, and we'll have the show out next week, a young man who graduated from Southern China University with a railway engineering degree paid for by a Chinese state-owned company. And he is just ready to go to be a railway engineer back in Nigeria to work on the Chinese-built railroads. You see that over and over again. So we shouldn't dismiss that part of it. the fact that this infrastructure dream is very much part of a young African dream because they want to use that infrastructure to grow and create opportunities.
I would say to maybe piggyback on this point of centrification of norms, and I think, Eric, that last point also addresses this issue, is that you know, the encounter with China creates change. And, you know, typically we look to the past for examples of how that change happens, but, you know, how it happened in the past isn't always how it happens today or moving forward. Lina, I know your work, you focused on this word networks a lot. And so I wanted to ask you maybe to elaborate on what you mean by networks in the China, North Africa context, and maybe give us an example of how it works. Because I think it's an important demonstration of this concept of how norms may be changing, perhaps in a slow way that's both meaningful but perhaps different from the past.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that so the way I see the networking, I see actually all of China-Africa relations through this prism of network building, and network expansions. And a lot of it has to do with investments in human capital, meaning all these trainings and scholarships that Eric was talking about, and opportunities for short-term visits to China for African elites. And so, you know, we're talking about, you know, security elites, we're talking about political cadres, party officials, journalists, you know, basically any walk of life, essentially. And these are thousands of such opportunities paid for by the Chinese government for Africans to go to China. A huge portion of that is about the actual experience of going around to visit Chinese cities and facilities and see China's development. But a lot of it is also, really, to me, a lot of it is built in social capital, which is to say, at the end of these 10 years, you have had essentially almost from every African country, political elites who are today in government, who have been part of these trips at some point in the past. And we have examples of this. And sort of with some countries, the relations and the network layers are very dense. With other countries, they are a little bit more shallow. With African countries, you know, it's with North African countries, the network density is not super dense. It's not very deep or thick. Reason being language. Language barrier is huge. A lot of these trips and a lot of these professionalization trainings rely on language capacity. So, for instance, most of it is done in English. North Africa, for instance, countries in the Maghreb, people or officials tend to be sort of, you know, fluent in Arabic and French, not so much in English. So that creates a huge barrier. And here it becomes really important, even if you had 10 students from Algeria study in China who are basically government officials or people who work for the government in some capacity or other, even if it's just 10, those 10 become a huge gap fillers because they've been to China, they've learned the language, they are now fluent, and they can be that missing link between all of these opportunities to communicate with the Chinese government and the Algerian government because of language barriers. And so we do have instances of that where an Algerian government is sending, even if it's a smaller number of its you know, civil servants to China for trainings. You know, they come back and they are fluent in Mandarin Chinese, and they translate documents, for instance, between the two governments. They make the relationship a little bit more fluid in that sense. And the networking, you know, the networking framework is, I think, is very important because it allows us to see, essentially capture what would happen. You know, what is the value of all these professionalization trainings? The Chinese government is just increasing its sponsorship of these trainings. And we see anecdotally for now, a lot of people come back and they speak highly of these trainings. They speak highly of what they have seen in China. They speak highly of the models that have been presented to them It's opportunities to have one-on-one, face-to-face meetings with high-ranking officials of militaries from African countries, from party members, and then we get to the party exchanges. Then that's a completely different story with youth party members, with all kinds of exchanges between CCP and all different senior and junior cadres from different parties in Africa. And these are youth maybe now, but in 10 years they might have positions in government, they might have positions that are going to matter for turning that social capital into political capital. And then all of a sudden China isn't that far away place that you only see through France 24 or through BBC, but it's actually a place you visited when you were part of this delegation, or you were invited to China, part of that delegation. And Chinese Politburo members, for instance, are not just this kind of abstract people, but there's a human face to them, because remember, you went to China for 2 weeks training, part of whatever a summit is, or whatever the initiative is. And I think that when we look at those networks, it really highlights a whole different other aspect of infrastructure that China is building in Africa. And it's a type of infrastructure we don't see. It's not necessarily as visible as trains and ports and whatnot, but it is really it's the type of infrastructure that is going to carry the China-Africa relationship in the future.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, because those were amazing and excellent points, which is it's happening in reverse as well. So again, we look at the state sector, but outside the state sector in the SOEs, for example, when I first started going to Africa back in 2005 and started going to Kinshasa and encountering Chinese engineers, they were bumbling and fumbling their way through. Now we're into folks who have been to 3 and 4 countries. They speak the language well. They've built local contacts. They are on their third project in an Arab-speaking country. They were working maybe in the Gulf a little bit. Now they're assigned to Algeria. They have built up the language and cultural skills. And these are the guys who are managing teams on the ground day to day. We also, as Enrico probably knows, at Beida, there's a whole now Arab language studies program. There's CGTN in Arabic. They're now doing social media in Arabic. The Chinese ambassador to Cairo is tweeting out every day in Arabic. That is something that's relatively new in the past 1 to 2 years, and I will see this intensifying. Do you remember back? There was a movie called Syriana a couple of years, about 10 years ago, and George Clooney walks out of the foreign minister, and he says the Chinese guy speaking Arabic and the American guy can't speak a word of Arabic. And you kind of feel that right now, because and again, I reference the United States because that's obviously, my home country, but we don't take that type of language acculturation very seriously. I do get the sense that on the ground, Chinese are doing that more because they're so pragmatic in terms of just getting stuff done. So I find the language abilities, it's a conversational level oftentimes. It's not fluency. It's just getting through the day. But to Lina's point, it helps build those networks and those relationships, and that language barrier, closing it from the Chinese side, I found to be very, very important and very poorly understood in the broader scheme of things.
Thanks, Eric. Andrea, you were waiting patiently. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it's no, I mean, everything was very interesting, so I would actually just more listening patiently rather than waiting. So I have a question, actually a small point on what Eric said about the language side. I would like just to add that the Chinese diplomatic service traditionally is built on interpreters. Now less in the past, but language has always been the backbone. Language training has always been the backbone of Chinese diplomats. So, and especially I would say this comes from a bit of my research, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. You can see that the level of specialization compared to, let's say, diplomats in Europe is very, very evident. And these are people that study the language, do multiple tours in different countries, go back to the same department in Beijing, and then go back again to the region. This is sort of intensity in the kind of the training of the people that are sent there. But going back to my questions, actually, it's about Algeria. I agree that Algeria is one of the most fascinating and most untold stories in China, Africa, and China, Middle East. Especially, like I was checking again our data that we have on the ChinaMed website, and Algeria is the country that has consistently had more Chinese contract workers in the entire region, including also the Gulf. We are talking, I think a few years ago, it was more than 90,000. Now we are about 60,000, but still like an incredible number, and definitely is a conservative one. Surely there are more. Also, is a country that had in North Africa is second only to Egypt in terms of market for Chinese engineering firms, and also in terms of investment I think is second or first. So my question is, how do other countries in the region look at sort of this Algerian prominence in terms of attractiveness for Chinese businesses? So sometimes, like through the work that we do at ChinaMed, we see that there is some comparison in let's say Moroccan or Tunisian media saying, oh, we should attract more, or we should, the Algerians doing a bit better, but it's always very superficial. It's a bit difficult to capture this aspect. So what do you think about that? Does this comparison exist?
If I can start, probably Eric knows more about this than I do.
I'll refer to you on that one.
But I think, I mean, from where I sit, sort of the most exciting relationship to look at in the Maghreb with China is actually not Algeria. To me, it's Morocco. And the reason why Morocco is the most exciting relationship is precisely because Morocco takes seriously its competition with Algeria, and actually puts, it hasn't had the last, 16 years that, Algeria has had with an administration that started to look inward and think about its, had a president since 2012 who just couldn't even, campaign for his own elections and still win them. And that had put a huge breaks into investments, into actually looking at development, economic growth. When, for instance, when you look at Morocco with its relationship to with China, things have moved forward a lot, and a lot of this has been sort of Morocco using its strategic location, having access to maritime fluidity between Europe and sub-Saharan sort of Western Africa, but also really transatlantic. All of these are really extremely important. And so, to give an example, Algeria had signed a deal with to build a port or renovate a port in Cherchell with China that's been, I think, going on since 2012, but that has just been dormant. And by comparison, for instance, Morocco showed up to this sort of in 2017, became sort of the first country in the Maghreb to join the Belt and Road Initiative. But just thinking about it from 2017 until today, it has had major investments and progress done attracting Chinese investments into its sort of maritime and port capacity building than has Algeria, even if it started its project in 2012. We see today a kind of signs that this new administration has been more keen on renewing relations with China. And so this port of Cherchell, for instance, that I mentioned, that has been dormant since 2012, was a major point of focus of a meeting that the president held with his cabinet, with all the ministers of the government last week. So they talked about it. They said, hey, it's about time to go back and revive the project and have the port built. And that's just one initiative among many others. Another one that's quite interesting is now that there is a new channel, that part of the state-owned media in Algeria that's called Marifa, that is essentially broadcasting and teaching Mandarin Chinese through TV. And it's part of this kind of new cultural initiative to learn more about China and to learn more Mandarin Chinese, or teach Chinese to Algerians. It's through TV this time, but other initiatives are also on the way. So we do see a bit of kind of waking up, revival, but also really trying to, I guess, complete or finish projects that have been started a long time ago, like the port I mentioned. But it is an untold story, because it's a story in my mind. Maybe I'm too cynical about this, because it's just been dormant. It's just been something that has not, Algerian administration was busy with other things in the last 10 years, and it has not really capitalized on all of these potentials for investments. When you look at the Morocco-China relationship, I think there's a lot of really exciting things. There are a lot of joint think tanks, for instance, a lot of joint initiatives between Moroccan scholars and Chinese scholars to write, to research, to Huawei, for instance, has a new initiative with Moroccan universities. There's a lot more going on in that relationship than, and it's possible also because there's always been competition between Algeria and Morocco, that Morocco has really taken this more seriously. But I think it's been untold because it's been a bit dormant.
If I can raise the issue of competition and take us over to Libya. One of the things we've seen is the regionalization of the Libyan civil war, and just about everyone in the region is now involved. Turkey's involved, Russia's involved, of course the Emiratis are involved, and we've sort of, like Syria, seen an outpouring of what's happening around Libya sort of filter its way into Libya. And I wanted to ask where China was. We know that China had a relationship with Libya prior to 2011. Obviously, the evacuation story has been told and is fairly well known. But I wanted to ask you whether China has a particular interest and or activity with respect to Libya today.
So Libya actually plays a very important role in contemporary Chinese foreign policy thinking. And UN Resolution 1973, if it isn't actually framed on the walls of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, it's burned into their minds. 1973, if you recall, was the resolution which was pushed by the French, Hillary Clinton and the French, to do intervention. The Chinese abstained on that vote. That will never happen again. And it's interesting, again, one of the themes at last week's China-Arab States Cooperation Forum was the word non-intervention kept coming up over and over and over again. And because, again, the Chinese they have an historical fear of intervention in their country, in their borders over Tibet or Xinjiang or any of the peripheral issues. That is rooted in the century of humiliation. It's rooted in a lot of historical issues, but the fact that that Libya plays such an important role, and they use this non-intervention, to great effect, because that is what, again, in Syria it plays very well. In the Palestinian territories it plays very well. It plays really well throughout the Gulf, Middle East, and the Mediterranean area. So I think in some ways Libya is very important. What I understand from what they're doing in Libya is the same thing that they're doing in the DRC and what they've done to great effect in Zimbabwe. Everybody assumed that when Mugabe was going to go, that the Chinese were going to be screwed in Zimbabwe. That was the working assumption because they had tied themselves so closely to Mugabe. And again, what's so interesting is that they come to these relationships without any ideology. They come out of pure pragmatism. And so behind the scenes, they were building relationships up with both ZANU-PF and Mnangagwa, but they were building up with the opposition. And we saw the same thing in the DRC as well. They're kind of placing bets on both red and black. So no matter what comes up, they've got a relationship in place. My understanding from what I've been reading over the past several years in Libya is they're placing it with both factions. And they've built relationships with both factions. Just they don't know who's going to win. They don't really have a stake in it. What they want is stability. They'd like to get the oil flowing again. They'd like to get their people back in there again if they can. And so for them, it's not an ideological issue as to whether one side wins or another.
Well, before I let Lina address this issue as well, I'd just like to ask whether the same applies. We've seen unrest in Algeria and Sudan, and the Bashir government is now gone in Sudan. And we know China has a long history there as well. So I wonder if the same dynamic you're describing in Libya also applies to Sudan and Algeria to a certain extent. Are the Chinese cultivating alternatives in those places as well, to the extent that we can see?
I don't know about the specifics of Sudan. It's not something I've been following. It just seems to be, and maybe Lina can speak to this because she probably knows a lot more. their approach, again, is a non-ideological, pragmatic approach that maximizes their interests. And so, again, it's not a pro-market versus authoritarian. It's not a socialist versus a liberalist. I don't think they approach it that way. They come in it in a very, very agnostic way. And as a result of that, gives them a lot more political flexibility to place bets and to build relationships. And they build relationships quite deep within the political parties. So they're going down sometimes not just at the top guy, but they'll go down, 2, 3, 4 levels down to start fostering relationships. And how does that manifest itself? It's what Lina was talking about in terms of these trips over to China. Well, they'll bring these kind of up and coming policymakers, very much like what the U.S. does with some of its Harvard scholarships and whatnot. And it just introduces them, it just wines and dines them, and it builds these relationships up at a pretty early stage. So the key takeaway on this is it's non-ideological, it's very, very pragmatic, and they're putting bets on both sides or multiple sides.
Lina, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's, I think Eric captured it well. I think it's, one way to think about it is that Beijing sort of plays a balancing act in a lot of these areas. And the balancing act in Libya has been precisely to try to be on the good side of both sides. And some of the, one of the biggest interests of China in Libya and in Mali and is the post-conflict reconstruction. I mean, that has a huge promise and the potential for gaining, and the potential for gaining contracts post-reconstruction is a huge motivation. And the way that it's done and the way from what I saw in just doing field work in Mali, the understanding in the Chinese state officials I spoke to is that you have to maintain at least sort of a minimum presence in the country so that you can always argue that you've been there through the difficult times and that these companies can demonstrate that they have an interest in this country and that they want to be here for reconstruction and for post-conflict rebuilding. A lot of that demonstration of being there really it means that you have to be in good terms and have to be safe and stable and secure, putting your government workers, because these are state-owned companies, at risk in these areas and keeping them there for a long time. And to do that, you have to have social capital, you have to have networks, you have to have a solid base of connections going on. And so, part of the balancing act is to be able to supply armaments to one side and give economic, or loans to the other side, or like Eric said, this act of not necessarily luring, but this act of demonstrating interest in the relationship by bringing in people to China for trainings and bringing in people to China for visits and for trips to talk about issues, for instance, is something I've seen a lot in Mali. We'd be talking to Azawad fighters and they will share with you a picture of their last trip to Beijing. And of course it had never been on the media, but it just shows that there is interest in sort of showing presence and showing this interest in building the relationship so that, you maintain solid connections to both sides if there are two sides. And that's the only way you can guarantee presence in the post-conflict reconstruction phase. And that is a big interest to China and Chinese companies right now. And so, to Eric's point, what this demonstrates is that it's not necessarily sort of an ideological battle, which is to say, I'm going to pick the good guys and back them through this. But it's more or less a sort of a longer end goal of post-reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction and other goals that mean you don't necessarily have to align one way or other, but you play a very narrow balancing act game.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question. We haven't really mentioned Tunisia at all. We've discussed Algeria quite a bit. In a few minutes, we spoke about Morocco and obviously Egypt. I wanted to see the relationship with Tunisia is an interesting one in the sense that obviously, if we're talking in terms of regime type, and Eric, I tend to agree with you. I think it seems to be a much more pragmatical approach rather than ideological. But the relationship with Tunisia is not necessarily one that, on the face of it, would seem like a natural fit. but we do seem to see Chinese interest in Tunisia, and particularly with the coronavirus crisis, perhaps Tunisia is starting to reciprocate. And I just wanted to know whether this is something that's more prospective, or is it something that's quite real?
I'll admit that my knowledge of China-Tunisia relations is actually quite limited. But what I do see again is a similarity that Tunisia is starting to try and compete a little bit with Algeria as a manufacturing hub, and Morocco, as Lina pointed out, as a manufacturing hub. Some of the news that just crossed over this past week was the fact that Tunisia is now trying to lure European manufacturers out who are leaving China to come and set up shop in Tunisia. And I think so setting themselves up as a manufacturing and innovation hub is probably what they want to do, and the Chinese are very well positioned to do that. Politically, I think the Tunisians have not, they're not doing anything like what the Egyptians are doing in terms of getting involved in sensitive issues like Xinjiang or Hong Kong. I haven't seen them as prominent signatories on any of these letters and whatnot, and they've been a pretty low profile. My suspicion is that Tunisia has very much been in the orbit of France for a very, very long time and has just not had the sophistication in terms of how to engage the Chinese. That is purely speculative on my part, and I think Lina could probably say more to that.
Yeah, well, I think, there's not a whole lot of sort of coming out of China-Tunisia relations. I suspect also because Tunisia, I mean, of all these countries we've been talking about, Libya, Algeria, it's not a resource-rich country, so there isn't a whole lot that sort of starts these conversations about China's interest in oil or natural, gas or whatnot. So from the Tunisian perspective, what you might want to get out of a relationship with China is possibly, very narrow, and that has to do with attracting tourists, because that's a huge part of Tunisia's economy. But as Eric said, more recently, this competition and entering into competition with Tunisia's Maghreb neighbors, Tunisia had joined the Belt and Road in 2018, and part of the bigger sort of projects that the Tunisian government has been trying to work on with China is the development of a port in a small island of Zarzis. And again, it's sort of playing off that strategic location of being also sort of in between a gate to Europe and to sub-Saharan Africa. But at the same time, I just don't think that there has been a whole lot of interest in Chinese on the part of Chinese companies or state-owned companies to be in Tunisia, because there hasn't just been a whole lot of construction or natural resources that typically drive a lot of these constructions, like in the case of Algeria. The reason why you see 60,000 and 90,000 Chinese employees and contracted labor personnel in Algeria is because the government has been using oil and natural gas revenues to build infrastructure. The latest one was that huge mosque in Algiers, or the highway cutting east through west, or whatever other construction projects that have been oil revenue driven, and same way for Libya. But that picture is a bit different with Tunisia. I think it's tourism basically, and more recently through BRI, potentially port development.
A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with a scholar in China, and the only reference of Tunisia that came up, and I just think this is an interesting anecdote, was that's where the Arab Spring started. And that was something that terrifies the Chinese. And they study the Arab Spring very, very closely because they want to make sure that that doesn't happen. If you remember, they banned jasmine and they banned all these different kind of residences. And so Tunisia, in many respects, intellectually is very interesting to the Chinese, because they looked at how did this happen? What was the government response? What happened? Because that's exactly what they want to avoid. So I think, again, there's not an economic or political interest, but there was definitely an interest in studying the origins of the Arab Spring.
Thank you, Eric. I think that's an important point. Andrea, you had a follow-up question you want to ask. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry. it was about these countries positioning themselves as manufacturing centers and gateways to Europe in this case. Recently, the European Union put tariffs on fiberglass, I believe, produced by Chinese companies in Egypt. This is the first time that something like that happened. I think the highest tariff is actually for fiberglass produced in China, and a lower rate is for fiberglass produced in Egypt. It's the first and quite unique, but it's seen by many as kind of a warning to Chinese companies producing in these countries. What is your take on this? How this could change eventually the triangular economic relationship?
The problem is that so many of these Chinese manufacturers, again, like Dongfeng, who set up their joint venture for, with Al Nasser in Egypt, rely on state subsidies. And that's what the Europeans think is anti-competitive. And that's what the WTO defines as anti-competitive, is that they have this advantage of access to low-cost capital, either in the form of loans or either in the form of just outright support. So, and this was a shot across the bow from the European Union to say, if you're thinking of coming into North Africa as a backdoor into the European Union, and again, this has been a concern of the United States, that the Chinese would use the AGOA trade relationship also as a backdoor, and they haven't done that, interestingly. China's shifted to Southeast Asia a lot, going in and using some of the free trade relationships there. But I think you're right to bring that up, because this is going to put a damper on a lot of that manufacturing. To the point in terms of Chinese manufacturing, both in terms of North Africa and Africa as a whole, much of it for now is focused on local distribution. The vast majority, so for example, the auto manufacturing plants in South Africa are meant for the African market. And now with the AFCTA coming in, I think that is going to open up more opportunities. So they may not actually look at using Africa as a gateway into Europe, because they might attract this kind of attention. And at the same time, the AFCTA may present more opportunities for them in the future to distribute and manufacture locally.
Lina, did you have anything to add on this point?
No, not really. I think Eric covered it. And I just wanted to mention AGOA, but then Eric mentioned it as well, which is to say that in many ways, the fear is that Chinese manufacturing in African countries, and especially in these free trade economic zones, are not necessarily interested in creating labor capacity in these countries, but it's that it would help create a backdoor for Chinese manufactured goods to go into the US without tariffs or into the European Union. And so I think that, to the extent that example you brought up with Egypt, I think it is probably a warning, that's going to be a way to challenge or a way to contain Chinese influence in manufacturing in Africa through that.
I don't think the Americans or Europeans have to be too concerned. And I'm a real bear on African manufacturing, only because I don't think the infrastructure's there to support the scale that the Chinese need. And that's what, here in Vietnam, Nike's got 180,000 employees creating shoes. You just can't do that in African countries. North Africa is better positioned than pretty much anywhere else on the continent in terms of the power infrastructure, the ship-to-rail infrastructure, but for the rest of the continent. So I don't think in that sense that the Americans and Europeans are that concerned that we're going to see waves of low-cost imports coming in from Africa. I think what they were trying to send a message with the Egyptian tariffs is that was a global message too. That was not just targeted at Africa or North Africa. That was saying, if you think you're going to try and outsource to a third country, whether that's Vietnam that now has a free trade agreement with the European Union, or Egypt, don't think you're going to get away with it subsidizing companies and then taking advantage of FTAs, somewhere else.
Thanks, Eric. But I think we don't want to take up more of your time than we've already imposed upon you. And I think the time's come for us to thank you, both Eric Olander and Lina Benabdallah, for your wonderful and informative comments. And it was a real honor and privilege for us here to be able to talk with you. So thank you on behalf of the ChinaMed Tel Aviv University collaboration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.